Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 4 cheat sheet. We have a very tough fixture in United versus Arsenal where we own a lot of our assets, but at the same time, I think this is a week to once again consider whether we want to move into these Chelsea and City assets that have a relatively good fixture run, and then also look ahead towards Newcastle that have a good run starting from Game Week 5, whilst also paying attention to these Tottenham assets who've done incredibly well so far from Game Weeks 1 to 3 and still have good fixtures, for example, for Game Weeks 4 and 5, and also maybe keep an open mind towards, let's say, West Ham players who will have a great game versus Luton, but then two very tough fixtures after that. As far as the midfield, though, we just start over there. I think Sarr is the asset where I would say he's been added to the cheat sheet simply because, we need a little bit more information at times when we're changing our teams and chopping and changing them. So when you look at someone like Sarr, I would need more information in terms of his starts to really say that he's a best asset. But so far, he looks like everything you'd want in a 4.5 midfielder. Someone who's quite creative, plays box-to-box effectively, and isn't like someone like Nakamba, who's just going to be playing each game, but not really going to have many avenues towards goals and assists. The one concern, of course, with Sarr is other players within this sort of Spurs midfield will come into play, like a Bentancur in the future, and that probably means diminished minutes for him in the future. It really depends on whether he continues to sort of keep his starting spot in the team. As far as the 5.0 to 5.9 assets, I don't really think there's any changes here, if we're being honest. It was quite impressive, of course, the display that both Andreas and Gibbs-White had. I think there was a little bit of an asterisk with Andreas, exactly what's going on with him. He has been sort of dealing with a knock all summer, and that's obviously carried itself into the Premier League, so we'll see what happens there. But as usual, he does remain a good pick, but the simple landscape of the midfield is that you want to be spending your money in those assets that are 6.5 plus, in my opinion. They're just much more consistent. But there is still some value to be had, particularly if you are on a 3-4-3 draft and you're slightly different from the template. So someone like Enzo, in my opinion, still holds a lot of value, whereas with Gibbs-White, you still have some tough fixtures here and there. As far as the 6.0 to 6.9 players, we have Ward-Prowse who has joined the cheat sheet. I still think that West Ham's run is a little bit overrated. I think, even as someone who brought in Sterling and Gusto to capitalize on that Luton Town fixture, the reality about Chelsea's run is that it's very strong until Game Week 8. Whereas with this West Ham team, even though they've been way more impressive than we could have initially expected because of how poor they were last season, they've had a great window and they've surprised some teams. But as I said, Man City and Liverpool, even if you think, let's say, West Ham have now become a very good counter-attacking team, and for example, the City and Liverpool games are technically ripe for that situation, I still think we need to sort of rate, for example, the quality of City's defense. And for example, also just Liverpool at Anfield. So that's why I actually don't really like these West Ham picks. I do think it's a little bit jumping the gun. There will be better fixture runs for this West Ham team, and that's when we should really consider those assets. And ultimately, that's why Ward-Prowse sits as a differential. The same sort of situation with Almiron. I do think that he's getting 70 minutes a game. Sometimes he's not even getting taken off. So he clearly, out of all the wingers in the midfielders so far, despite not scoring whatsoever, is more interesting in terms of the security of his minutes. And we know that he's still capable, of course, of doing well in the Premier League. We saw that last season too. I don't think his underlying stats are actually as poor as people make it out to be. He was not, as lucky as it seemed last season, because when the sort of season bared out and when he recovered from injury, he ultimately ended up performing relatively close towards his expectations. And the expectations are good because this Newcastle team are a strong offense. I just think that I wouldn't really consider Almiron as a priority transfer, and I also just simply like other Newcastle assets. I like their defenders and I like their forwards a little bit more, just because the forwards are very, very thin right now. So when I look at, let's say, a Newcastle mid, it's hard to sort of justify putting them into my team when you have so many better assets in other teams that actually play much more minutes or are much stronger assets, like a Foden, for example, even if you think that his minutes are a little bit sketchy. As far as the 6.6 sort of premium assets, I do think it's Mbeumo, Diaby, and Eze. I've re-risen Eze simply because the next 3 run of games is very, very good for Eze. Aston Villa, of course, should be a tough game, but when you have Wolves at home and Fulham at home in your sort of 3-game-week calendar, I think it's fantastic for Eze. The, of course, only asterisk I would say is what happens if he was to join City, but it doesn't really seem like those links are actually anywhere close, and it seems like Eze is likely to stay in Palace, and for that reason I think he's a great pick going forwards. If you're, let's say, moving out of a Mitoma or March, I think this is the perfect window to go into someone like Eze if you already have Mbeumo in your team. So when I say this, I mean Mitoma and March just simply have a bad fixture run. They're one of the most interesting assets. We saw that from underlying stats. We saw that from the opening fixture run. but you're always going to likely book a transfer away from these midfielders, or even, let's say, an attacker in João Pedro. So this is the perfect time, I would say, to reconsider your ownership of Mitoma in March and probably shift away from them. Because even though Brighton are very good offense, the simple reality is outside of game week 6, it's very hard to sort of fit a Brighton attacker into your team. And the same goes for someone like Estupinian in the defensive position. So I do like Mbeumo and Diaby and Eze. I do think Mbeumo is the absolute king still. I can understand a lot of players not wanting to go with Mbeumo. If simply the reality is you can still afford someone like Sterling or Foden ahead of him, I can understand not going with Bryan Mbeumo. But for me, I still think that he's an asset that's sort of staring us plain in the face and is just very, very good. And also, I've given Richarlison a drop. I just think that, unfortunately, with some of these really limited minutes outings, it's just like Kai Havertz in the situation there, where you're now starting to see that the manager probably will find systems where Richarlison won't get minutes. They'll probably look for a replacement too. As far as Kai Havertz, because of the depth that Arsenal have, he's not someone that's going to be essential to the team, especially with Jesus back into the team, which is also, for example, why I decided to transfer him out 1 week earlier than I initially intended to, because the Jesus injury return was a lot faster than expected. As far as the 7.0 to 7.9 asset tier, I think Sterling, Foden, Maddison are absolutely clear. The only reason why I dropped Maddison last week was because of the injury concerns. So he ultimately ended up playing around 70 minutes of the game, and he was taken off as a sort of precautionary substitute. I think he was totally fine. It's not like the Reece James situation from game week 1. And going forwards, I think Maddison's a fantastic pick. As long as he's fit to play the next 2 fixtures, you've got a great asset there, and of course you've got a Luton fixture on the horizon as well. In terms of actually deciding between all these assets, I still think Sterling is sort of my #1 priority. He's the cheapest. He's also someone who has a really clean fixture run, so not necessarily any bad fixtures. Nothing as good as Luton Town at home, but still a very, very good run. And once again, I always go back to the historical underlying stats, because Sterling has been a world-class player before. And I'm not saying that he needs to be a world-class player to do good, because simply he's a 7.0 asset. And so for now, I think Sterling is just a great pick to go with. As far as Foden and Maddison, I think it's tough to pick between them. I'd probably actually side with Maddison, because it seems like he is more of a talisman, arguably, than, let's say, a Foden is in the City team at this present time. Now, of course, Foden is someone who looks incredible, and for example, in the Newcastle game, you could argue that he was the talisman in that game, but that's not always the case game to game with Foden. So that's sort of how I feel about Sterling and Maddison. Whereas Sterling, of course, he's also almost an advanced forward within the Chelsea team, so that's a huge benefit to having Sterling. And you can also listen to his post-press match conferences in terms of how he talks about the change in his position and his discussions with Pochettino as well, in sort of leaving him to play a little bit more of a free role for this team. As far as Grealish, I think that I gave him a rise last week, and I think he's very deserving of sort of sitting in that tier. He's an interesting one because I think he's arguably more nailed than, let's say, a Foden and Alvarez, but you always know that the ceiling with Grealish isn't necessarily as high. So it's always that sort of risk to return thing where, are you looking at Grealish as someone who's a bit of a safe pick? You're struggling to pick for a midfielder. You could go with Grealish then. But I think the reality is the midfielder landscape is a lot stronger. And I think for that reason, Grealish isn't someone that I would class as a best tier asset. And then at 7.0, the sort of differential with Bowen is right there. I think the issue with Bowen, in my opinion, is still those City and Liverpool fixtures. I can't look past them. Luton Town's fantastic, but it's the same sort of logic as Luis Diaz, where, in my opinion, you're getting that fantastic fixture, let's say, versus Bournemouth at home, but then you have to deal with maybe 2 fixtures that are quite tough back-to-back. It's tough to navigate those fixtures. You want to see assets from a little bit of a medium-term to long-term basis, unless you're planning to wildcard very, very shortly. So, unless you're, let's say, planning to wildcard on Game Week 5, I can't really see the value to Bowen at this point in time. So he continues to be a differential until, let's say, the fixtures become a lot smoother for West Ham. And then with Diaz, Martinelli, and Diogo Jota, I feel like these are all assets that are interesting, and they could always become better assets at certain times. But in my opinion, the Liverpool team is starting to show, of course, a lot of depth and rotation. We saw Luis Diaz get taken off. It was a bit of a tactical sub. So if you can remember the Arsenal versus Crystal Palace game where Arsenal suddenly went down to 10 men, very normal why Martinelli went off. Very normal, for example, why Luis Diaz went off as well. So whilst I wouldn't say Luis Diaz is a bad asset, the simple reality is I think he's a differential. His underlying stats aren't exactly, let's say, stratospheric. So he's not someone that you immediately have to get into your team. And until he, let's say, continues to perform exceedingly well, I'm not going to move him up beyond some of the other assets that we have that are much more interesting to me at this point in time. And the same thing with sort of Martinelli, just because I think there's a variability from game to game with his minutes. Sometimes you can see him complete a full game. Sometimes I think he can also be an early sub for Trossard. It just really depends on, let's say, what Arteta lines up with, which at this point in time, with the amount of flexibility I think Arteta has shown with his sort of tactical nous, there is going to be a little bit of a change there where Martinelli might not be an essential asset. And as far as someone like Diogo Jota and Diaz, these players just have to deal with the minute concerns that we have with this Liverpool team. Moving on to the 8.5 plus players, I still have Saka as the sort of cream of the crop asset, and Fernandes and Rashford as well. Whilst I think this is actually a great window to maybe consider going out of Rashford, I would only really do that if I was wildcarding. If I wasn't wildcarding, I think Rashford is an asset that's here to stay. Because when you think about, let's say, a Tottenham player, their fixtures are actually very tough from, let's say, game week 6 to 7. So that's around the time when Rashford himself has good games. And it only really works out to, let's say, go for a Tottenham asset so that you can move back into someone like a Rashford in the future. That's sort of my opinion on these picks here. Now, of course, you can go back to Maddison, sort of go back and forth like a yo-yo. But it's very hard to book these sort of luxury transfers in FPL, and that's why I still think Rashford and Fernandes are very good. Rashford, of course, hasn't really, stood up to the expectations of what we have, and Fernandes has outperformed him. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Rashford's not worth it as a pick. I still think he can be a good pick going forwards. The large concern I have with Man United really is the defense at this point in time, and not really with the attack. So, in terms of Odegaard and Son, I've dropped Odegaard, and I think Son continues to be a sort of second-tier asset. As I've been saying with Son, the big thing we need to see, of course, is that first penalty for Spurs. We've seen press conferences from Angie, and you can probably suggest that maybe as a captain of the team, Son can actually easily get penalties, but I'm not so confident about that for now to, let's say, make Son a cream of the crop asset. And at the same time, of course, we know Son's an excellent finisher, but the underlying stats haven't necessarily really improved with Son over the last year, and we still need more sample size, but Son still doesn't really look like an asset where I think he's an essential transfer. And the same goes with Odegaard, particularly if he's off penalties. You can argue that we need to sort of assess what's going on with Arsenal's change in tactical formation, how they're sort of implementing Havertz into the team, but I think there's enough so far to say that Odegaard might not be the most interesting asset for now, and he could even be a transfer out this week if you want to be a little bit more aggressive and you don't have any issues with your squad. As far as Salah, continues to reign as a second-tier asset, but there's going to be a time and a place for Salah to be in our teams. And I think game week 7/8/9 are going to be windows when we think about that, absolutely. As far as the forward position this week, I don't think there's actually many substantial changes. I've given Archer and Semenyo both boosts because I really think that they're the cream of the crop in terms of the 4.5 forwards. The reality is, of course, Bournemouth and Sheffield United are not teams that we expect to do well. However, they still will have good fixtures in FPL. They will even face each other. They will also face some other weaker teams like Luton Town and arguably, let's say, Burnley for now. These are sort of the teams, even, let's say, including Fulham from a defensive point of view, where we think that they're the teams to target when you're looking at attackers. So I think, of course, with Semenyo getting 2 starts and him maybe getting better minutes in the future, he's a good pick. And with Archer, we just need to really wait and see, but I'm expecting him to be a nailed asset. So you could even argue that he's better than Semenyo at this point in time. But once again, information is king. As far as 5.0 to 5.6 assets, I don't really think there's anything too interesting here. I've given Nketiah a rise, but I still think that his window to be a good asset is quite short. It's clearly the case that he might not start a lot of games, but he's already performing at an exceptionally good level where I think Arteta will continue to include him at various stages of the games, whether he's a starter or whether he's coming off the bench. My concern, of course, is that you don't really want to be spending that sort of money on a player who you don't know exactly how he's going to be utilized week to week, and that's sort of the issue that, for example, João Pedro finds himself in. But the nice thing for João Pedro, of course, is that his competition in Julio Enciso has been injured for a while. So it's a lot easier to find a landscape in the future where João Pedro can actually find a starting spot in the team going forwards, as opposed to Nketiah, who I think is always going to be dicey from this point on, now that Jesus is back. So with Adebayo and Morris, obviously with Luton Town, I just don't think we have huge expectations over them. The only reason why they might have been valuated as a better asset is because we expected a potential double game week in the future, but that also doesn't really seem to be coming to fruition. And until that time comes, we don't really have to consider them at all. With the 6.0 to 6.5 players, I think Awoniyi has done so well where I've got to give him another green. But in reality, Nottingham Forest still have very tough fixtures. I know he seems like a player who's fixture-proof because in reality, he's scored, I think, 6 or 7 games in a row now. And he's close to, let's say, breaking some records that we have in the Premier League itself. But Awoniyi is, of course, still a pick that I probably wouldn't want to rush into. And he's also someone that can also be an early sub. So he's not someone like Solanke where you can argue he's a 90-minute player. But, of course, at the rate that he's firing at, you can argue that he doesn't need to. As far as Wiese and Alvarez, I still think that these are sort of the cream of the crop picks that you can actually go with for now. Wiese seems like a safer pick where you can generally say every game he's going to start and maybe just play 77 minutes, but that's really good because the fixtures are still okay from an attacking point of view, and ultimately this Brentford team have probably surprised their expectations from an attacking level. And then with Alvarez, you've got this sort of high risk, high reward asset, but obviously it can still go poorly, right? There's going to be fixtures where, just like Foden owners last week, even though they got an assist, they could actually be dealing with an asset who's only playing 25 minutes a game, and that's sort of the risk that you have to understand that you're bearing whilst owning Alvarez. However, I think because his price is so good, he is sort of worth that risk, and he is sort of worth that reward. And I do think Alvarez has a space in your FPL team just because the forward landscape is so thin. And in the 7.0 plus assets, the 7.9, I've got Jesus added in. I still think he's a differential because I'm not exactly sure, as I said, with Nketiah, for example, performing so well, and also with this Arsenal attack sort of struggling to find its way, I don't really think that Jesus is a priority transfer, not to mention that he might not even start the next fixture. When we talk about the most reasonable picks right now, I still think Jackson's the absolute best. And then Isak and Darwin are the sort of interesting players that you can go for and maybe jump ahead of the curve. Isak, I know a lot of people have already jumped over because his price rises have been truly evident, but now that, of course, the City and Liverpool games come and gone, you could be looking at Isak for a fantastic run going forwards. And then obviously with someone like Darwin himself, this is a good run where I think you can take a risk maybe. If you're really struggling to find a forward and you're not going for Jackson, or let's say you're already tripled up on Chelsea, because the forward landscape is so poor, you might want to jump ahead of the curve and go for Darwin. But I think there's a huge risk attached to it because he's also much more expensive than someone like Alvarez. The big thing, though, is if Darwin, let's say, gets 2 out of 3 starts, I actually think he's worth his price because he is that explosive as a pick and his underlying stats are truly that good. He is one of the most elite players in football when it comes to underlying stats, and the simple reality is he just lacks the minutes. But when he has good minutes, he's a great pick. What you might want to do actually is just wait for Aston Villa to come and go, that game at home at Anfield, and just see whether Darwin gets the start. And if he continues to, let's say, build on starts, then maybe he can be a good pick going forwards. But I think it's okay to, for example, jump the gun on Darwin just because the forward landscape is so poor, but recognize that it's a luxury transfer. As far as the 8.0 plus picks, I could arguably move Watkins back to a premium player, but he still has tough fixtures in my opinion, and I think there is a time to go for Watkins, and it's not necessarily now. It's probably game week 7 at the bare minimum. So that's the sort of situation with Watkins. I think you have some high upside in players like Wilson and Isak, but they do have minutes concerns. Watkins, of course, removes those concerns from you. You could argue that he's not explosive, but I still think the underlying stats are very good for Watkins. And if you actually wanted to, let's say, play it safer, and you have enough punts in your team, then Watkins actually might be the glue that your team needs. As far as 4.0, of course, we just got Haaland, so nothing really to say here, and we can just move on. As far as the defenders this week, I haven't really made any changes whatsoever. Nothing key, I would say. It's more the case that with the Botman injury and us not knowing exactly what's going on with him, I've given him a drop, which means that Burn gets added into the cheat sheet. The reality is, of course, Burn could play both center back and left back, and that, of course, positional flexibility, now that Botman might be injured, could actually be very good for Burn. So if you were actually considering a transfer in the future, or if you're wildcarding, it could make sense to go with Burn if you get additional information on this Botman injury. As far as Henry, I don't think anything needs to be really done with him. He has fantastic fixtures on game week 4 and 6, and ultimately he's an asset that we probably want to keep for the rest of our teams if you already own him from the start of the season. As far as cash and Pow, I mean, I've added cash towards the cheat sheet, and you can definitely think about going for cash, but their fixtures are still tough, and it's hard to see whether you're actually going to be consistently starting cash going forward. But if he nails down this spot in the team, and when, let's say, Game Week 7 comes around, you can definitely be including cash into your sides. And the same thing with Pow, if, let's say, you don't want to deal with that risk where maybe cash will lose his spot in the team for whatever reason, which I think is actually rather unlikely because they just don't have enough depth in this right back position, and he's performing really well. As far as Estupinian at 5.0, I've given him a drop. And honestly, all the assets here at 5.0 to sort of 5.1 aren't really interesting right now. In my opinion, Estupinian and Saliba have tough fixtures. Saliba is still a centre-back at the end of the day, so he doesn't have that sort of attacking upside that you can argue that Estupinian has. The same sort of logic goes with Zinchenko because I think there's a bit more flexibility and depth in this Arsenal team now, so it's not necessarily the case that Zinchenko is immediately nailed in the team for the time being. And with Schär, he gets a rise because Newcastle's up-and-coming run of fixtures is starting to look very good. And with the City assets, I've classed them all as differentials. I think my one concern is that Stones can come back into the team very shortly, and that probably means 1 to 2 of these players will actually lose their position in the team every week. Because as you can see with Akanji coming out and having a sickness, someone like Ake can, for example, step in and deputize. But if Stones is to come back into the team, that could actually mean less minutes for all of these players. And so that's my main concern here. You might be creating some issues for your team sooner than later. And ultimately, even though City's fixtures are really good, where just like Brentford with Rico Henry, where you have game weeks 4 and 6 being exceptional, actually City's run after that fixture isn't particularly good. So that's my only concern really with City assets, and the lack of attacking upside is a true thing with these defenders here. Walker's underlying stats have actually looked quite good for the start of the season, but you're not exactly sure whether he'll continue to sort of play this sort of wide, almost wing-back-like role for this team for the time being. And then as far as 5.6 to 5.5, I like Ruben Dias because I still think he's absolutely nailed. And then Chilwell is someone who, even though he completely missed an opportunity to score a goal in the previous week, I just have a lot of faith in because he's in such great attacking positions. He's a winger, completely out of position, and just has a good fixture run. As far as 6.5, I've given Trippier a rise and Trent another fall. I think Liverpool's defense is in absolute tatters right now, particularly with the Van Dijk red card. And then Trippier, of course, he's just about to come into this fantastic run where I think he could arguably be an essential asset. So that's sort of the landscape of FPL. It really depends on whether you think Trippier will be rotated with someone like Livramento. But I do think Trippier is someone who has always shown to be very fit. I know his age and he's coming along, but the reality is he was actually fully capable of playing a lot of games, even in Atletico Madrid 2 years ago, and I think he's still capable of doing that this year. And that's sort of my opinion on the defenders for this time being. As far as the goalkeepers, the only change really has been to push up Areola, because I do think he's the true best 4.0 keeper now. We didn't know this at the start of the season, but he is now sort of, for example, that default number 1. Just had a man of the match performance versus Brighton. And then Pickford is someone that I've dropped alongside Johnston, just because I think that he could lose his spot in the team with the transfer rumours. And that's sort of the only concern really with Johnston. As far as 5.0 assets, no real changes here other than dropping Onana. I don't think any of these assets are really particularly good. Yes, of course, Vicario has gotten 2 clean sheets in a row, but I'm not going to say that Spurs going forwards are going to get clean sheets non-stop. I think there's still a defense in the works, and ultimately there's more value in, let's say, going for Ederson or just simply residing with some of the 4.0, 4.5 picks that are much cheaper right now and can actually allow you to sort of beef up your midfield. And then as far as the 5.5, 5.6 picks, look, Ederson for me is still supreme. Alisson is actually such a good shot stopper that I think the funny thing is he sort of reminds me of like a more expensive Raya from last season, where he's actually forced to make so many shots because his Liverpool defense is so poor, but he's actually so good at making these shots, he will actually inevitably get a lot of points each game. And you can see that, for example, the Newcastle performance with yet another fantastic game versus Newcastle. If you guys remember the previous match last season when Pope, for example, had a red card. And then with someone like Pope, I would say he's worth a rise, but because so many Newcastle defenders are available at cheap prices, and this is the same logic with someone like Emiliano Martinez at the 5.0 position, where because their assets at the defender positions are so cheap, there's no real reason to actually go for these goalkeepers, because I think they're a little bit too pricey, and the defenders just are readily accessible for a cheaper price. And that's going to be the cheat sheet for this week. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead. Let me know what your thoughts are on the cheat sheet. Have I missed anyone out? And I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead.